Bienvenidos al quinto Congreso de Deporte, Dopaje y Sociedad, organizado por la Universidad Politécnica de Madrid y la Agencia Española de Protección de Salud en el Deporte. Es un día especial para nosotros y hoy que me toca presentar a mí al señor David Howman, pues yo creo que no tenemos mejor noticia que la confirmación que me habría gustado que hubiese podido dar el director general de Deportes, Jaime González, que él pasa al índice del Consejo de Ministros del próximo viernes la aprobación del Real Decreto Ley por el que se implementa en el ordenamiento jurídico español la normativa antidopaje del Código Mundial 2015, con lo cual los que conozcan un poco la situación actual significará que informaremos a continuación a la Agencia Mundial Antidopaje para que declare en cumplimiento a la Agencia Española de Protección de Salud en el Deporte como Organización Nacional Antidopaje y a continuación se produzca el levantamiento o la suspensión del laboratorio. Laboratory staff. Grandes noticias, ¿no? Es un día muy emotivo para nosotros, sobre todo ver a tantos amigos, colaboradores, antiguos maestros, otros siguen siendo maestros todavía de mi persona que no dejo de aprender y encontrar continuamente nuevos amigos que nos ayudan en la agencia a sacar nuestro trabajo adelante, y especialmente con la Universidad Politécnica de Madrid y con el profesor Rodrigo Pardo, que son realmente el gran artífice del Congreso. Presentar para mí al señor David Howman es fácil leer un currículum personal, es fácil saber sus puestos anteriores, lo tiene en la web del Congreso, ustedes lo conocerán. Y quizás el describir a David Howman únicamente por un currículum, por unas posiciones, por posiciones claves que hayan sido, quizás es fácil para cualquiera, ¿no? Eso en cualquier página web lo pueden identificar, ¿no? Eso, el valor que tiene David Howman en su presencia aquí, él ha sido director general de WADA durante un periodo largo, sigue siendo colaborador de WADA. David Howman es una de las personas que no es que haya participado en la historia de la lucha contra el dopaje actual, él ha escrito gran parte de esa historia. Y si no la ha escrito él directamente, ha provocado que otros la escriban. Y es el principal artífice del sistema actual antidopaje. Es una de las personas claves que puede haber a nivel internacional. Cuando hablamos de la lucha contra el dopaje, normalmente vamos a ver críticas y vamos a ver unas continuas conversaciones, a veces incluso prácticamente informales, ¿no? David Howman lo que va a explicar hoy es qué es lo que significa la lucha contra el dopaje, cuáles son los retos del futuro y de dónde venimos. Y la lucha contra el dopaje no significa una mera sanción, significa proteger los derechos de los deportistas limpios a una competición justa en igualdad de condiciones. Las normas que establece la Agencia Mundial, validadas por el Acuerdo Común del Movimiento Deportivo y de los gobiernos, que son los que le dan autoridad a la Agencia Mundial Antidopaje y que validan el trabajo diario de personas como David Howman, lo que hace es proteger a nuestros jóvenes deportistas, que son modelos de la sociedad desde edades muy tempranas, de corromper un deporte que consideramos que debe ser referencia y modelo para todos nosotros. Ese es el trabajo que a veces, cuando no se da la importancia que tiene a la política antidopaje, la política antidopaje es esa póliza de seguro que te garantiza un éxito creíble. La política antidopaje no es un control ni es ni siquiera un resultado analítico. La política antidopaje es la garantía de credibilidad de todo lo que representa el deporte y la credibilidad de todo lo que hay detrás de nuestros deportistas y de todo lo que hay de cada euro que se invierte. Es la credibilidad de un país, es la credibilidad de nuestros deportistas, es la credibilidad, por tanto, de toda nuestra sociedad. El deporte es la imagen que cada país proyecta al exterior. Eso es la relevancia del trabajo de David Howman, desarrollado durante más de 13 años como director general de la Agencia Mundial Antidopaje, no solamente escribiendo normas, sino haciendo que se ejecuten y logrando que cualquier deportista esté sujeto a las mismas normas en cualquier lugar y en cualquier momento. Con esto, sin más y por no adelantar el contenido de la presentación de David, nada más agradecerle su presencia aquí, su asistencia. Thank you for all, thank you for your job, thank you for protecting the clean athletes around the world. Thank you.
Mr. President, distinguished guests, friends and colleagues, buenos dias. In my country, kia ora tātou, it's Māori. We have a native language in New Zealand. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to my speech. Thank you very much for inviting me here, Enrique. thank you very much, all of you, for your attention to what I think is a very important topic for all of us who support clean athletes and clean competition. For me, it's both a privilege and a pleasure to be here in Madrid to address the conference and to offer some views from my experience on the future for anti-doping, the fight to protect the clean athlete, the fight to protect the rights of the clean athletes worldwide. This conference is very timely in view of the findings that were set out in the second McLaren report published last November, particularly having regard to the reactions to the report by members of the sport community, members of the anti-doping community, and members of the public. Because as a result of that report, there have been many debates and many issues as to the future of anti-doping. If I start from the basic premise for why we fight for the rights of the clean athlete, I have already heard this morning from colleagues at the front desk saying that it's important to support the intrinsic values of sport. That's often referred to as the spirit of sport, and it's the celebration of the human spirit, body and mind, and characterised by values such as ethics, honesty, respect for rules, self-respect, respect for others, fair play, and healthy competition. If sport is void of these values and others, it might be argued it is no longer sport. Doping has been and still is a major challenge to these values. Breaking the anti-doping rules, which are now very well known by all athletes and all members of their entourage, really amounts to cheating your opponents, cheating the public, cheating the sponsors, committing fraud, and really damaging the values of sport that I have talked about. 17 years ago, the World Anti-Doping Agency was established to undertake the independent task of uniting the sport movement and governments together in fighting doping in sport. The first job, and I had the privilege to be part of it, was to write a code of rules which would be accepted, implemented, and practiced in every country and every sport. Now, I just want to pause here. The code, which was written and has been revised on 2 occasions, is the only set of rules that applies in every country in the same way in the world. It's a very, very unique set of rules. And I reflect on that to say, in other parts of our society, have we been successful in creating such an orderly set of regulations? And the answer is no. We have different ways of driving, we have different speed limits, we have different stop signs, and that's just driving a car. So we are united in this for the right reasons, in my view, the clean athlete. The first code was adopted at a World Conference in Copenhagen in March 2003. Sport adopted that code by accepting it within their rules before the opening ceremony in Athens in 2004. Governments had to recognise it through an international treaty, and that's because WADA is a non-governmental organisation, an NGO. So for governments to recognise the rules of WADA, they had to do it through a treaty. This international treaty, under the auspices of UNESCO, was written and ratified in under 2 years, a world record for an international treaty. So by 2006, we had a set of rules uniting the world. As I said, they've been reviewed and revised twice. The first occasion was a World Conference convened here in Madrid in November 2007, and the second was at a World Conference convened in Johannesburg, South Africa in November 2013. On each occasion, before any change was made to the rules, there was a very lengthy consultation period, 18 months to 2 years. Everyone part of the anti-doping community, whether it be government or sport, was consulted and asked for suggestions. At the end of this rather lengthy process, there was a unanimous decision at both the conferences to accept the changes in the rules. WADA's job as the regulator and the monitor was then to ensure everybody actually did that. Everybody implemented the rules, everybody practiced them, and everybody did it properly. To enable WADA to do that, we asked for a change to allow us to have investigative powers in the last model of the rules. So in 2013, WADA was given the power of investigation, not only to look at compliance, but also to conduct investigations of its own. So it allowed WADA to be more effective in its compliance monitoring role, but also allowed WADA, when a German television program screened in November 2014, December 2014, to set up an independent commission to look at the allegations that had been raised in Russian sport. An independent 3-person commission, headed by Richard Pound, the first president of the agency, investigated these allegations of widespread doping in Russian track and field. The first report of this commission was in October 2015. It was detailed and explicit in its content. As a result, the National Anti-Doping Agency of Russia, called RUSADA, was declared non-compliant by the WADA Foundation Board. The accreditation to the laboratory in Moscow was revoked. And the International Athletics Federation, the IAAF, was asked by WADA to take appropriate steps in relation to the Russian Athletics Federation. The IAAF suspended the membership of ARIF. Then what? The second Pound report dealt with the IAAF. There were allegations that they had not done their job in looking at blood profiles of athletes. This report exonerated the IAAF from any wrongdoing in relation to the handling of blood profiles. However, it stated in the report that there had been a vast amount of evidence relating to corruption committed by IAAF officials in relation to the handling of doping cases, and that this was handed over to the French police. Subsequently, the president of the IAAF, or the past president, I'm sorry, Lamine Diack, his son, his personal legal advisor, and the head of the IAAF anti-doping unit were all subject of arrest warrants by the police in France, as were several Russian athletic officials. The warrants have been executed on 3 of these people. One has remained in Senegal beyond the jurisdiction, and the Russians have remained in Russia beyond the jurisdiction. So at this time, in January 2016, the world of sport and anti-doping, in my view, was effectively on notice as to wrongdoings in Russia. The Pound Commission had inferred that the Ministry of Sport in Russia was implicated in a state doping program, but did not go further as its terms of inquiry were narrow and precluded more investigation. The clean athletes of the world wanted more to be done. The the WADA Athlete Committee, headed by Becky Scott, wrote an open letter to the WADA President, Sir Craig Reedy, asking on behalf of many athletes and athlete groups that more inquiries be made by the Pound Commission. They were advised that more evidence was needed before WADA would consider any further investigation. Lo and behold, this happened. In May 2016, right at the time that the WADA Foundation Board was meeting in Montreal, the New York Times published an interview with the former Moscow laboratory director, Grigory Rodchenkov, indicating that indeed a doping program had operated in Russia since 2010. The details he provided were extensive and demanded further investigation. WADA agreed. Professor Richard McLaren was commissioned to undertake the new task and was given broad terms of reference, including the specific job of investigating the details exposed by the New York Times, so as to prevent the situation of lack of jurisdiction as met by the Pound Commission. Because of the imminence of the Olympic Games in Rio, McLaren was asked to report in July, even if only by way of an interim report. So if we capture the information that was available to the world in May 2016, it was pretty obvious to anybody who had read or read about the Pound Commission reports, seen the German television programs, read the New York Times article, that something really terrible had been going on in Russia for some years. Values and integrity of sport were totally ignored by officials and athletes in that country to a degree not previously seen. And I'm old enough to remember the days of the East Germans. This was much worse. And it was apparent to everybody who had taken notice before McLaren reported in July. So when he tabled his report in July 2016, the contents ought to have been seen as coming by everyone. They were strong. They said that the Russian ministry had concocted a doping program to ensure success by Russian athletes at major events. The WADA Executive Committee was unanimous in recommending to the International Olympic Committee and the International Paralympic Committee that Russian athletes not be invited to Rio. Each of those organisations approached the issue in a different way. The IOC delegated responsibility to its international federations to make decisions on whether athletes should come or not. The IPC had no hesitation in banning Russia, and when challenged by Russian officials and athletes in the Court of Arbitration for Sport, had their decision upheld in law. Then what? Well, the IOC said that WADA was broken and had to be fixed urgently. How it has been broken and what has been broken has not yet been detailed. Then came the second part of the McLaren report in November 2016. Details, evidence, facts, a huge volume of material indicated a state-controlled or state-sponsored doping program since 2010. More than 600 athletes were implicated, many officials, summer and winter sports. There was a huge beat-up for the 2012 Olympic Games in London and the 2014 Winter Olympic Games in Sochi, in that many athletes who competed in those events were said to have doped. Commentators worldwide have been dismayed at the extent and methods of the cheating. It is a staggering report. The IOC still says WADA is broken. In another suggestion, however, the IOC says that perhaps there should be an independent testing authority, at least for all international sporting federations, and possibly for all countries. The National Anti-Doping Agency say an independent testing authority might be helpful for sport and that they would assist such an exercise, but that it should not involve them nor governments, as they are already independent and operating effectively. The governments are saying that if the international federations want something, then they can feel free to go ahead and build it at their expense, but with help from the governments if asked. WADA says it will do what its stakeholders recommend and has established a number of extra working committees to look at governance, testing, laboratories and more. So that's the scene that we're presented with today as I talk to you. To cover it a little bit more, I think we need a bit more history and a few of the challenges that confront the anti-doping community and must be confronted by it. First issue is that doping is no longer an issue which is confined within elite sporting boundaries. Rather, it's a problem that permeates other areas of our society and has a much wider impact, therefore, than it did several decades ago when it first became a major challenge for sport. WADA provides the pointy end, the real sharp end of the sport issue, with its focus only on elite athletes. When the curtain is drawn, what is revealed is a social problem of steroids in schools, among our security forces, the presence of the criminal underworld in trafficking prohibited substances, an unregulated supply of non-sanitised drugs through the internet, profit-making opportunists, including many in local gyms, making a huge amount of money, amateur athletes doping in recreational events, young people taking steroids in a bid to look good, they're not athletes, old people taking peptides in an effort to remain young. That's our society, and sport is a small part of that society which exists now. And if I just pause here, I remember when I was in Montreal and I bought some wine at the local wine cellar, and naturally I bought New Zealand wine. I took 3 bottles to the person who was asking me for money, and she said to me, well, there's 3 of the same kind, so I'll just bill you for that. And the first bottle was $25. I had to tell her that each bottle was a similar label, but as they went along, the next one was $35, the next one was $45, and I said, I cannot cheat you out of your money. That's not my job, is protecting integrity. And she said, what did you do? I said, I am the Director General of the World Anti-Doping Agency. That's drugs and sport. She said to me, well, walk 200 yards down the road to the YMCA gym. There's a guy sitting in the corner who sells really good steroids. That's how close it is to what is going on now. And that brought it home to me in a pretty sharp fashion. The other issue that I think we need to just be aware of is that allied criminal activities in sport, such as spot fixing, match fixing, bribery, corruption, have all been seen by WADA in carrying out its mandate. They, of course, are not part of our day-to-day mandate, but evidence has come to WADA's attention and provide additional issues for society in general. In the public health arena, there is very little, if any, scrutiny on kitchen laboratories. There's minimum scrutiny and control over imported substances, much of which comes from Asia. And therefore, there's not much attention being given to the growing use of steroids, as I outlined it before. It's almost as if society accepts steroids and allied substances in our lives. Peptides, growth hormone, testosterone are becoming more commonplace, and who is noticing? And what is the effect of that on elite sport? Now, these are typically government issues falling under public health. And typically governments do not act unless there's a disaster. So if there's a death, or 2 deaths, or 3 deaths, or maybe even now 100 deaths because somebody has taken banned substances that have been contaminated, maybe then the government will start to do something. But that's the area which we have to confront as a challenge. If we look then to sport, we all know now that the analysis of blood and urine does not catch all those who are breaking the rules. We know that. Only 2% a year of those who give urine and blood are identified as breaking the rules. 2%. Why is that? Well, there's one reason, and that is money. If you look at the amount of money now that is available to sport people, and you compare it to the amount of money that's made available to those who are trying to keep sport clean, then you'll understand. Not one player in La Liga, but many players in La Liga earn more than $30 million a year. That's the annual budget for WADA. So if you look at the budget of WADA and say one player in Real, no, 12 players in Rio earn more than $30 million, then you start to see the size of the problem. Sport now is an $800 billion product worldwide, probably more. $800 billion. And how much does sport spend on protecting its integrity? And the answer to that is not very much, or certainly not enough. I think, therefore, the clever cheating athlete might now be confident in having very highly paid scientists and doctors and lawyers that he or she might beat the system under the historic approach. Detection has got better, that's for sure. But don't forget the extent to which people will go to achieve financial gain and personal international glory. The dopers have figured out more ways of avoiding detection. Microdosing, cocktails of drugs, design of drugs, superhydrating, transfusions, and indeed daily we learn more as to how they're going about it with the information that came from the McLaren report. And also information that has been gained from the retesting of samples stored from both the Beijing and London Olympic Games. 98 more positive cases so far from those games, not detected at the time of the event. And retesting of samples that were stored from those events is still going on. Now, I'm sure that WADA will publish data showing why and how there have been so many new cases. Is it because science is so much better now than it was 4 years ago, 8 years ago? Is it because the machines are more delicate and can pick up substances that they couldn't before? I don't know, but we must find out. And we must also see the very strong benefits of long-term storage of samples. From the McLaren report, the second one, it's also obvious that criminal behaviour was part of what occurred in Sochi. Not only criminal behaviour, but probably committed by those who were responsible for the security of the country, the FSB. More reason in my mind for the anti-doping community to make sure it partners properly with law enforcement and others with evidence-gathering powers like Interpol, World Customs and so on. The cases of non-analytical evidence are mounting. Remember, it started with Balco, the little laboratory in San Francisco in 2003. But we now have investigations being carried out here in Spain, in the United Kingdom, the United States, the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, Norway, Canada, Australia, and others, where information gathered in conducting inquiries has been useful in providing or discovering those who are cheating. They are a very important, integral part of an efficient anti-doping program now. And I have to say, this does not mean that your national anti-doping agency becomes a police outfit. It can work alongside the police and others who can gather information. And if those relationships are good and the partnerships effective, then information will be gathered quickly. Now I turn to some of the challenges that I think we are facing in looking to the future of anti-doping. And the first is the engagement, both continuing and increasing, of the criminal underworld. It's been suggested that at least 25% of world sport, and I'm not talking about elite sport, I'm talking way down to third division, women's football and so on, 25% has some involvement of the criminal underworld now. I know in my country there is illegal betting going on at an under-16 girls' soccer match, girls' football game. Under 16. Because there's money to be made. The second area where there's money to be made is the trafficking and distribution of prohibited substances, as I've mentioned already. For $100, a $100 investment, one could expect a return of anything between $1,000 and $10,000. And I've often sat back and thought, perhaps that's the business to be in. It's a pretty good return. And in many countries, there's no risk of being prosecuted because there's no laws against it. So you can understand why the criminal underworld is engaged in doping. How do they do it? They get raw materials from Asia. They don't know what they're actually receiving. There's no labelling. There's no sanitisation. And they're putting that into little pills and selling it to your kids, your grandchildren, and so on. So there's a huge risk of damage to one's health. And it should be of concern to governmental authorities. The betting I've talked about. It's not just betting in the illegal or unregulated betting market. It's also betting in the regulated market for the purpose of laundering money achieved by selling drugs and money achieved by other ill-gotten gains. The second area of a challenge is the growing and encroaching black market for pharmaceuticals. WADA has very good arrangements with the international pharmaceutical industry. Part of that is to ensure that when information comes of the black market supply, the industry and the regulators have that evidence. At present, it's estimated that more than 25% of the world's pharmaceutical products emanate from the black market, and at least 50% of the drugs sold on the internet are counterfeit. They're non-sanitary and, again, potentially dangerous to health, a public health matter. The third challenge is the increasing sophistication of cheating at the high end of sport. We've always had the dopey doper, the athlete who makes a mistake, but we're now getting the high-end doper who's not making a mistake, doing it intentionally and getting away with it. Sophisticated doping. We're addressing that with research, social science research, science research, to try to find the current trends and what we can do about it. There's a special fund established at WADA with the IOC and governments putting money in, $12 million, to help achieve that. The IOC has another fund of $4 million, also for the same reason. We're waiting for the outcomes of those projects. The fourth challenge to what we do is costs. Costs a lot of money to run an anti-doping program. Costs a lot of money at the laboratory for the analysis. There is a view out there that says we're already spending too much on this. The results are not good enough. You're not catching enough. Therefore, you shouldn't have as much money. And as I said before, let's get this into perspective. For an $800 billion industry, surely sport should be protecting its values, its integrity, by putting in more money to protect it. Should not be left to the governments to have to do all this all of the time. My thesis is that sport should be deserving of its autonomy by protecting its values and integrity with appropriate financial commitment. Governments can and do assist. One might expect more from sport now. I'm waiting to see whether sport responds to this challenge. The next challenge is the trickle-down effect of doping, and I've mentioned it already. Not just the elite athletes. There's going to be a lot of cheating at the World Masters Games. There's a lot of cheating done by younger athletes who are trying to get professional contracts. In the national sport of my country, rugby union, there are young players, 16, 17, taking steroids to bulk up so that they can get professional contracts. A study in South Africa showed that. Those athletes don't get tested. We have to look at our educational programs to see that they improve and get to the people that are requiring to be shown the ills of doping. Cheating now pervades all levels of our social spectrum. We've got major scandals involving politicians, some fiddling with their expense forms, some avoiding tax, many of them being kicked out of government. In the world of academia, there are many, many stories now of plagiarism. There was a big case at Harvard University not so long ago where plagiarism was being conducted by more than 60% of the class in an open book exam. Open book exam. And the Harvard dean, on discovering it, said, "Without integrity, there can be no genuine achievement." Same in sport. Without integrity, there can be no genuine achievement. So we now are living in an age where the values of honesty and integrity are constantly under threat from a win-at-all-cost mentality, where the path that one takes to achievement is considered irrelevant so long as one can claim success at the end of it, no matter how. And I don't want to look at the United States of America, but it's so tempting when you look at the last election over there. It's not just at the elite level, it's the trickle-down thing. Recreational cyclists and runners taking substances. Even a case in Denmark of a National Federation board member testing positive after competing in an amateur event. What sort of an example is that fellow showing the athletes? Perhaps there should be a greater sense of outrage at these trickle-down effects. The counter to that is that nowadays we're living in a society where there are so many drugs available from the pharmaceutical companies that people say, well, you should expect what is happening in society to be happening in sport. People are taking drugs every day. Whether it's good for their health or not, they take them. Well, maybe we should accept that. But do we have to? And should we? Ethically, I say no. A word in relation to athletes. WADA and all anti-doping communities are organisations looking after the rights of the clean athlete. Sport relies on athletes for its survival. Sport cannot exist without clean athletes. Athlete groups are very important now in the representation of athletes. There are many areas in which appropriate representation can lead to the expounding of the rights of athletes. Sport and government must be very aware of its athletes. They must take careful steps to ensure they are fully engaged off the field of play. The rights of the clean athlete must be protected. The clean athlete must be heard. I'll just pause here. Since I left WADA in July last year, I have already been involved in consultation and assistance to athlete groups around the world who do not feel that they are being listened to by sport officials. They feel they're being put down, and they feel that they are being told they don't know enough about sport, just get on and play the game. That's not good enough. It's not good enough. The entourage. It's not just athletes who are cheating. Most of them, in fact almost in every case of a doping case, the athlete has been persuaded by somebody else. Either assisted, counselled, sometimes tricked, and occasionally forced into the downward spiral of cheating by doping. Coaches, trainers, doctors, scientists, lawyers, sports administrators, even some misguided parents, all of whom should know better, make a mockery of their responsibilities and trivialise the years of training and dedication of the trusting athletes whom they betray. We must do something about that. Again, an issue for prevention. Again, an area for education. Another challenge is the legal challenges that we have. And there are many things that lawyers do to make the process elongated. I'm a trained lawyer. I know how to do that. Delays in process can be delays in justice. And you have to remember it's not just the individual athlete who's under scrutiny. It's the rest of the athletes in the field that might be prejudiced if justice is not done as quickly as possible. We have issues of data protection. We have issues of privacy. Heightened, I believe, and I just saw this morning another incident of the hacking that has gone on into anti-doping websites with more expose of the therapeutic use exemptions that have been granted to athletes. How can you stop that? How can you stop that when governments, the most powerful governments in the world, can't stop or prevent hacking? It's a very perplexing and frustrating issue. We have an issue of food contamination. We have issues in relation to supplements. We have issues relating to what we describe in the rules as specified substances. How can you be consistent if one athlete in one country gets a certain penalty for the same substance as another athlete in another country who gets a warning? We must make sure we deal with that. So what can we expect of anti-doping going forward? First, my view is that anti-doping cannot and should not be isolated from the other challenges to the integrity of sport that I've mentioned. The same bad guys are involved in corruption, bribery, match fixing and so on. The sooner that sport responds to all of them in a meaningful way, the better. Many national anti-doping agencies and international federations are now expanding their mandates to cover these aspects under one roof. So it's not just anti-doping, it's match manipulation. And of course here in Europe you have those two conventions which mean that governments have to look to public authorities to combat them. So why not do it under one roof and save the money by not having two bureaucracies? Sport says it can't deal with some of these matters and that governments should. Fair enough. Sport is now looking at its own governance problems. Change is happening. The IAAF is a good example. They got change quickly, but yet had good consultation and lengthy thought. And now they have an integrity unit, an independent integrity unit, which will cover all the issues I've just raised. Some say, and you might note a sense of cynicism in my voice, some say that FIFA is also changing. WADA has worked closely with national law enforcement agencies, Interpol, Customs, other investigators for maintaining integrity. All those people that we've engaged with over the years say that the criminal underworld is the problem that has to be directly confronted. It's the reason that Interpol got engaged with WADA. From a common sense perspective, it might be therefore efficient to think of a united world body formed between sport and government and others, such as the betting industry, to tackle those problems. As I said, international federations are forming integrity units, so are NADOs. There are a couple of organisations out there working hard in that direction, private organisations, one emanating from Qatar, who have persuaded several bodies to be part of what they're trying to do. The IOC is running an integrity conference today. It'll be interesting to see who was invited and whether the protagonists are there or only the people who say what the IOC would like them to say. So funding and independence are two major issues that require our attention. In the same way that WADA is dealing with criticisms of its shortcomings, funding must be confronted openly and directly. And there are some possibilities, and why don't we talk about them? Why not take a small percentage, add on a small percentage to the broadcasting rights, to the sponsorship rights? Instead of making it 100%, make it 100.5%, and put the 0.5% into a fund that can be used to address issues of sporting integrity. That's not very difficult. Nobody's losing anything. In fact, those who are providing the money can feel good about what they're doing. Maybe we could collect a small amount from the regulated betting industry where so much money is spent on sport. Why not give some money back to sport? And from the unregulated betting industry, when the police grab the monies that are ill-gotten, why not take a percentage of that? Now, those are just three relatively simple ideas which do not involve governments putting their hands in their pockets, nor sport federations putting their hands in their pockets. So why can't we do it? Might be too simple. WADA is now running a lot of committees to see what can happen as a result of the criticisms from the IOC. A governance committee, an independent testing authority committee, a committee to review laboratories, a committee to pull together all these findings, maybe a committee to change the code, maybe a committee to change the WADA constitution. And let's remember here, WADA is a private Swiss foundation which operates legally under Swiss law. To effect change to the constitution, it has to be done under Swiss law. It can't just be done because everybody in the world thinks it should be. Maybe we'll have another World Conference in 2019 to address these issues. But in the meantime, we have a problem with Russia. No laboratory in Moscow, no national anti-doping agency, no athletics federation. And what will happen? There needs to be leadership. The onus is on sport leadership. Will anybody have the skill to really make a difference in Russia? WADA is trying. trying with help from NATOs to get people in that country to see what they need to do. But I ask the question, is Russia responding appropriately? And that is the issue for the WADA Foundation Board and its Compliance Committee. If no leadership exists for Russia, then other organisations in the world who are asked to be compliant to the code will say, why should we be? Nothing's happened to Russia. So if nothing happens to Russia, why shouldn't we get away with it? And I'm not talking about Spain here. I'm not talking about the rules. I think we must make a very firm differentiation. The only reason that Spain has been non-compliant is because it did not have a government in force to make a change to the rules. It's quite different from the behaviour that has gone on in Russia. Quite different. So if we don't sanction properly, then we're going to head back to the old days where anarchy prevailed and every sport had its own rules and every country had its own rules, and we don't want that. So I hope that WADA might get powers of sanctioning. It's a jurisdictional nightmare, a legal nightmare, but it might happen. Will we ever get to this situation where we catch more of the cheats and that the prevalence of cheating is actually combated by their being detected? Can the science improve? Will the public tire of all this squabbling between WADA and the IOC and so on and just turn away? Is it happening now? Are people so cynical that they won't go to events? Sport must stand up for itself. Clean athletes must be heard. Perhaps there should be an international union for athletes. And when athletes do not see that they're getting the right deal, they strike. When they strike at the time of a major event. Maybe that will get the message through. And that's not beyond comprehension. I think it's time now to respond efficiently and effectively to these challenges that I've mentioned and to the values of sport. These present issues are surely greater than the stimulus that was provided in 1998 by the Festina arrests in the Tour de France and by the IOC debacle in the bidding for Salt Lake City. While we await the outcome of the many arrests of FIFA officials, the trials of the IAAF officials, we have the opportunity to act decisively. When we look at the other issues coming from the McLaren report, I think it's time now to do something. Where to now for anti-doping? When I addressed my last Foundation Board meeting in May 2016, my last meeting as Director General, I said that anti-doping was at the crossroads. Will it advance by going directly ahead? Will it deviate and go to the left or to the right? Or perhaps even go in reverse? I believe at present the car is parked with the handbrake on. I hope shortly it will release that handbrake and proceed directly ahead with any change required for independence, transparency and practicality implemented. Clean athletes deserve that direction. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, thank you very much, David. Bueno, yo creo que David Howman ha tratado, yo creo, todos los puntos de interés, al menos de actualidad a nivel internacional, ¿no? Sobre la lucha contra el dopaje y ha planteado cuáles son los nuevos desafíos de cara al futuro y yo creo que no se ha dejado ningún tema relevante, al menos por mencionar, ¿no? Entonces con esto abrimos el turno de preguntas, teniendo en cuenta que es una oportunidad única de disfrutar de David Howman aquí, que es quizás la persona que más preciso puede informar sobre cualquier tipo de tendencia de la Agencia Mundial y hacia dónde se dirige el movimiento antidopaje. ¿Alguna pregunta? Sí, si no pregunto yo solo. Primero allí y ahora aquí. Izquierdo.
Espera.
Bueno, Operación Puerto, muy actualidad. He's interested in knowing something about the Operation Puerto and if the WADA is working about the blood samples. No?
his journalist.
Operation Puerto has been a very frustrating exercise for WADA and a very frustrating exercise for those athletes who were waiting to see what had been happening here as a result of that doctor's transfusions. So, regrettably, we still don't have an outcome of any revealing nature. We have some issues that are being discussed by the lawyers, and it rests there.
Mr. Howman, I'd like to just backtrack for a second. You covered a great many topics in elucidating detail. Going back to the IOF and the 2016 games in Rio and the wrestling body in Russia, or as it affected Russia, that is. What went on there? That was a political decision?
What occurred in relation to the participation of Russian athletes at Rio was that the IOC said to each of its federations, go and look and see whether any of the athletes in the list representing Russia should not go. And they said one of the reasons for not allowing athletes to go would have been a previous doping infraction, which in fact is non-compliant with the code. So, in my view, the IOC acted in a non-compliant fashion by demanding that of its federations. I was no longer the Director General of WADA at the time, and I took no part in any correspondence or complaint about that. But it was a pity that that happened. Therefore, each of the federations made decisions. One or two were challenged. One in particular, a swimmer from Russia, challenged the FINA suggestion that she be banned, and she was successful in overcoming the ban by the federation and went to Rio.
Y al fondo había otra pregunta.
Buenos días. Yo creo que gracias a WADA, la gente que llevamos mucho tiempo en el deporte, se ha avanzado mucho en la lucha contra el dopaje. Pero estoy de acuerdo con usted que en este momento ha perdido cierta credibilidad y que quizás, bueno, los propios deportistas tienen que dar un mensaje. Usted, como abogado, ¿cree que los deportistas podrían pedir daños y perjuicios? Está muy bien que tengan 10 años para que le devuelvan las medallas, pero todo lo que han dejado de perder en el camino, ¿qué piensa usted?
I agree with you. I think that we must have strong lawyers around the world who are prepared to do these sorts of things in a pro bono fashion. And too many athletes have told me that they've sought advice on this sort of action and been told it was so expensive that they couldn't advance it. Now, you have to remember that if you sue another athlete, you have to get the right jurisdiction for that suit to take place. So I would suggest you wouldn't do it in Russia because you would be laughed out of court probably. So you need to establish a place where perhaps that person has money or perhaps that person has an agent with money and you go from there. But when I was younger, I was always told that you ought to, as a lawyer, do work in your system for those who can't afford to pay for it. And athletes are in that minority, unfortunately, on the majority of time.
Aquí hay otra pregunta. Aquí en...
Señor Howman, uno de los grandes problemas que tenemos los médicos del deporte en relación a las normativas antidopaje es el uso de los corticosteroides. WADA permite el uso de esos corticosteroides por diversas vías y no por otras. En cambio, las analíticas les cuesta muchísimo a los laboratorios decidir qué vía es la utilizada para el corticoide. ¿No cree usted que, vistos los estudios científicos que no demuestran en absoluto que el uso de corticosteroides mejore el rendimiento deportivo, WADA debería hacer un planteamiento en ese sentido?
Thank you for the question. It's a very compelling one, and it's one that has been discussed by doctors and scientists for as long as I have been involved in anti-doping, which is 25 years. Of course, corticosteroids can provide an advantage to an athlete, therefore is performance enhancing. It's on the list. The issue is to try to distinguish that from topical use in a situation where it's pretty much allowed and that where the person is trying to get an advantage. There was a committee set up last year under Madame Valérie Fourniron from France to investigate that whole issue. It hasn't yet reported back yet, so I'm guessing that the work has not been completed, but it's addressing the very issue you raise, and everyone's hoping it will provide a practical outcome. So I think we just have to be patient to wait for the report.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Buenas tardes, señor Howman. Bueno, mi duda apunta principalmente hacia el trabajo de la prevención, pero más que nada dirigido a los países de habla hispana. Tuve la oportunidad de estar en Río trabajando en outreach de WADA, y algo que me sorprendió particularmente tiene que ver con el poco acercamiento de la educación directa en temas concretos hacia los deportistas que existe hoy. Hoy las herramientas educativas que entrena WADA son principalmente en inglés y se dirige muy poco a la realidad de los países de Latinoamérica principalmente. ¿Cuál cree usted que debería ser el camino, pensando un poco, que durante los Juegos Olímpicos de Río un montón de delegaciones deportivas se acercó al stand a pedir charla, a pedir actividad educativa para preparar de mejor manera a sus entrenadores, a sus deportistas de élite, y donde la respuesta de los deportistas, preguntas simples como las que se hacen en el outreach, eran mayoritariamente equivocadas frente a temas tales como negarse un control? Quizás confundo un poco la pregunta, pero me gustaría conocer su opinión respecto a lo que se ha hecho en el plano educativo, principalmente en los países de habla hispana, y cuál debería ser el camino a seguir a futuro, pero principalmente dirigido desde WADA, en este punto de la prevención.
Well, the first issue at the moment is that the two languages that WADA has are English and French. That is because we are a Swiss private foundation, and that's the law that prevails. I shouldn't say we, because I'm no longer there, but what WADA has been doing over the last few years is work very closely with the Spanish government and very closely with the regional office we have in Montevideo and Uruguay, where we are reliant on Spanish-speaking countries to help us write the materials and put the materials to be available for athletes. And so far that has been very successful. I'm sorry to hear that if something happened at Rio where athletes were not provided with information in Spanish, that would surprise me, because I was hoping when I left that there would be a number of Spanish-speaking people on our teams. But it's an area which must continuously be addressed to ensure that the vast numbers of athletes who speak Spanish can be catered for properly. And therefore, my answer to you is positive. Let's achieve that by sticking together as Spanish-speaking people and make the materials available and make the teachers available.
Respecto, perdón que haya interrumpido este tema respecto a la comunidad hispanoparlante, independientemente de la situación de WADA y la elaboración de materiales en diferentes idiomas, porque al fin y al cabo esa problemática al fin y al cabo se da en otras comunidades, como puede ser la China, que es lo que WADA siempre defiende, o otras que son hispanoparlantes, y yo creo que en algunos seminarios internacionales lo que defendemos nosotros es, lógicamente, el reforzar nuestro propio papel como organizaciones nacionales antidopaje, reforzar el lazo hispanoparlante, reforzar el trabajo con Latinoamérica y España para tratar de elaborar ese tipo de materiales y ese tipo de actividades. Es cierto, a lo mejor, como españoles y como hispanoparlantes, nos gustaría que el español fuese un idioma oficial de WADA, lógicamente. Entendemos que es una petición que hacen otras comunidades, en lo cual siempre será una petición, yo creo que eterna, que se haga, y en otras circunstancias yo creo que tenemos que hacer es trabajar de la forma más conjunta posible y compartir más conjunto, porque al final en nuestro día a día, que puede ser más o menos intenso, hace que solo pensemos en nosotros mismos, que pensemos en resolver nuestro problema diario, que solo pensemos en resolver incidencias y una serie de actividades y no pensemos en futuro, ¿no? En construir una comunidad fuerte hispanoparlante dentro de la comunidad antidopaje. Y yo creo que tanto no solamente a nivel educativo, sino a nivel de posicionamiento político respecto a la Agencia Mundial o respecto al Consejo de Europa, Unión Europea, aquí como es aquí, las organizaciones regionales de gobiernos y comités olímpicos a nivel de Latinoamérica deben tener un posicionamiento propio y claro respecto al antidopaje, independientemente del desarrollo de las políticas o la capacidad económica que pueda tener cada uno de los países, ¿no? Porque la realidad es muy distinta de unos otros países. Aún así, yo creo que uno de los papeles fundamentales es colaborar bajo la coordinación de WADA, como se hacemos en todas las áreas, pero una de esas actividades es asumir nuestra responsabilidad y, si no es nuestra responsabilidad, al menos asumir un protagonismo que creo que nos corresponde, no solamente a la agencia española, sino a todas las agencias que estén trabajando. Vosotros dos, precisamente, Uruguay y Chile, a lo mejor tienen un especial nivel de desarrollo y un especial compromiso que se debe tener con toda la región.
Hola, aquí. A mí me gustaría hacer una pregunta relacionada con la posibilidad o el planteamiento que tiene WADA de cara al futuro de implementar metodologías de análisis más generales que permitan hacer controles dirigidos en mayor cantidad y considerando matrices nuevas, como puede ser la sangre en gotas en papel o el método de saliva para abarcar más deportistas y luego los controles, que son muy caros, si llegan a un grupo reducido de deportistas, vayan más dirigidos y tengamos controles más diana.
I think you're absolutely right. And if we stand still and don't advance by looking at those sorts of methods, and hair follicles, there's a whole series of things that people are now using for identification of drugs in one's body. And the old-fashioned urine and blood is becoming that, old-fashioned. So if we don't keep up with advances that have been made in our society for other health or criminal reasons or whatever, then we're stupid. And I think that part of what is being examined at the moment by WADA is, can we rely on those methods? And if so, can we implement them under the code and can we get on with it? And I just think we need to advance. So I agree with your comment 100%.
Good afternoon, Mr. Howman. Mi pregunta está un poco relacionada y era saber su opinión para conseguir un mayor grado de eficiencia, qué camino seguir, si aumentar el número de controles, aumentar los recursos a dedicar a servicios de inteligencia para hacer controles más dirigidos o incluso fomentar la utilización del pasaporte biológico. Gracias.
How long do you have for my answer? I think what we have to do is spend every dollar, every euro wisely. And so we have to get away from spending money for the sake of having a number of tests. We've got to get away from quantum and we've got to move to quality. And quality means testing on the basis of information. It means testing for a reason, not random to get a certain number of tests done this week. We only have so much money. It comes from all of us. It's public money. And so at the NATO level, we have a responsibility, in my view, to spend that wisely and be accountable back to the public for the way it's been spent. Now, whether that is conducting more blood testing for the biological passport or urine testing for the biological passport, that's really up to people who are more expert than me. But the basis of it always should be, do it wisely and with information. Don't do it stupidly for the sake of it.
Muchas gracias, Manuel Fonseca. Nos conocemos desde hace mucho tiempo y quería saber en este momento lo que has dicho sobre el coche parado en la encrucijada con el freno de mano echado. En algún momento tiene que arrancar, pero ese arranque tiene que estar también consensuado por los distintos caminos que se abren en la encrucijada, que esos son los gobiernos en general. Porque hay que tomar muchas decisiones que dependen de los gobiernos, no dependen del mundo deportivo. Todas esas decisiones, en este momento en la UADA, ¿hay capacidad suficiente como para quitar el freno de mano y acelerar? ¿O está estancada esperando a que los gobiernos del mundo asociados a la UADA den su conformidad para ponerse en marcha?
I think if I can continue to use the analogy, the governments are pushing the car forward. And I was lucky enough to be part of a government meeting informally held in London in mid-November, where the key governments around the WADA board table met to discuss the way forward and were united in their views. Now, those views were then expressed at the Foundation Board meeting, which took place 2 days later. The trouble with them were they were not expected by the sport movement. And so instead of having consensus in the pushing of the car forward, we had a little bit of a pullback. And I'm waiting now to see what that in fact is. What encourages me is that after that meeting, the second McLaren report came out. And I believe there was a real degree of shock that was felt by Thomas Bach and other members of the IOC when they saw the degree of the information and the evidence. And the previous, if you like, reticence to accept McLaren was taken over by, I think, an effort to go forward. So I think in the next months, I'm hoping to see that rejoining, if you like, of the effort. I doubt whether the brake will be pulled off, but I think there's going to be a bit more pushing from the back.
Buenos días. Mi pregunta era que, por ejemplo, al tener los músculos memoria, ¿sería justo que un deportista al que en un control le detectaron dopado, tras el tiempo de sanción, volviera a competir? Por ejemplo, el caso de Ben Johnson, que tras los 2 años de su sanción volvió a competir en las Olimpiadas de Barcelona. ¿Sería justo que volviera a competir?
Let me break my answer into 2 parts because it's a very sensible question. And many would agree with you to say, one offence and you're out forever. Regrettably, on the other side of the fence are those human rights lawyers and judges who say, no, you've got to have a chance. So the rules were changed and started in 2015 with a 4-year ban for those who are really breaking the rules. And that meant an Olympic cycle. A second offence, yes, you could get banned for life, but not a first one. The evidence that you talk about in terms of muscle memory is being gathered more and more. And there was a good study done in Sweden a couple of years ago which showed that steroids were in the body for up to 4 years. Hasn't gone beyond that yet. So I think we need more information if you were going to start implementing a longer first period sanction.
Bueno, bienvenido a España, Mr. Howman. Soy Juan Gutiérrez, del diario AS. Quería preguntarle, en una reciente entrevista que ha concedido usted a la agencia EFE, en una de las respuestas decía que la dilatación del proceso de la operación Puerto le ha quitado eficacia. Mi pregunta es si podría desarrollar un poco más esta respuesta y si está relacionada con lo que acaba de decir de los debates de los abogados que están en este momento produciéndose en la AMA.
Look, I think if I can be quite open and direct with you, I think the delay between the argument in the Court of Appeal and the release of a Court of Appeal decision alarmed me. If that had occurred in my jurisdiction, there would have been an outcry. I can't comment further than that because I'm not really aware of the Spanish legal process, and I don't therefore want to come and be a guest of your country and be critical of the judiciary. That's not my role. My role is to say, I think there's a problem there, and maybe somebody here can do something about it.
Señor Howman, muchas gracias por sus palabras. Su opinión es muy cualificada a nivel internacional y en temas de geopolítica internacional así es. Entonces querría preguntarle si desde el punto de vista de WADA cree que los siguientes hechos pueden tener efectos en WADA. Uno es la potencia comercial de China. Dos, la forma de hacer en Rusia. Y tres, los resultados electorales en Estados Unidos.
Thank you for your introductory comments suggesting that I was a geopolitical animal. I'm very familiar with politics, both sport politics and government politics, but at this level and not at that level. And I think all of us in this room would have the same degree of that level as I do. I think the challenges that we confront with leaders of countries, and I've met many of them, is that there are occasions when they do not know the detail of the events that they might be talking about. And so you get a misguided comment which is blown up into a huge issue simply because the individual didn't know what really the background was. Now, I think the test of what is going on in the world now will be seen in sporting terms in the coming months as to the participation of Russia in the Winter Olympic Games in Korea and the Paralympic Games in Korea, and the continuation, if you like, of the way in which sport goes about choosing hosts for its events going forward. And we've had enough conjecture about FIFA World Cup. I now read today that the IOC are thinking of perhaps not just awarding the 2024 games when they meet in Lima later this year, but also the 2028 games, so that there won't be a loser. And I think what they're doing is saying, well, Budapest is not really a runner, but Paris and Los Angeles both are, so why not we give one to one and one to the other? And maybe let's look at a time when the current president of the US is not the president for the one for the other. I should have said that's a geopolitical answer, not a sporting answer.
Hola, gracias David Howman por venir aquí al Congreso. Yo tengo una duda como deportista de alto nivel que soy, y es que considero que la lista de sustancias y métodos prohibidos puede ser a veces un doble juego para aquellos que hacen trampas. Y entonces, bueno, mi pregunta es ¿qué visión tiene la WADA respecto a deportistas que sin padecer ningún tipo de lesión, ni de dolencia, ni de enfermedad, se administran una gran cantidad de sustancias permitidas, ya sea vía oral o vía intravenosa, dentro de los límites que marca la lista?
I have a response to that, which is I'm scared of the medicalisation of doping. In other words, what you are saying is some athletes are being told to take substances that are not on the list, not because they need to, but because it will help them increase their performance. And that is unethical medical guidance, as you well know, but it's going on. We are aware of situations where, for example, a medicine properly given to somebody who suffers the condition was tested to see whether that person with an increased medication level would improve their performance, and it worked. And so what they did was then apply that medicine to athletes who didn't have the condition because they saw the increase in performance. I find that abhorrent, but it falls into the category of unethical medical behaviour, and we need to report those instances to the various registration bodies responsible for doctors. But it tells you the lengths to which some athletes are going, or their advisors are going. And that bothers me and it worries me because it's a real challenge to the integrity issues that I've talked about. So I'm with you, and if you had any information or anybody had information along those lines that could be followed up, I think athletes should come forward and give it under the anonymous process that we've now got.
Hola, buenos días. No cabe duda de que el deporte es un negocio muy lucrativo en la actualidad. Habitualmente se habla de estrategias científicas y programas de dopaje, pero ¿cuál es el papel en el doping sobre los sponsors y los medios de comunicación?
A very good question, thank you. I think the answer to that is first, let me take sponsors. My view is that sponsors should look at the values of the sport that they are putting money into to ensure that the integrity levels which they would demand are being reached, and therefore they are in a very powerful position of doing something. We saw that to a degree with FIFA, not involved in doping, but involved in the corruption at their executive committee. And many sponsors were the ones who led the charge and effectively pushed FIFA to changing. How successful is for another day. The same thing occurred with the IAAF. So sponsors can be strong and effective. The media, I'm married to a journalist, so I need to be very transparent about that. And I have a press conference every day I get home. And I'm a trained lawyer, so I'm also pretty good at asking questions. So we have this conversation which nobody answers anybody. That's just a side on that, not answering your question. The media has a most important role to play because they retain an independence. My only concern with the media is that there are a number of journalists who are told that only if they express a certain view will they be given accreditation to events. You'll probably learn more about this when you hear from Hayo Seppelt later in this conference. But it takes a strong journalist to stand up to a very strong institution that says you can't come to this press conference or you can't come to our event because you are somebody who doesn't sing the song that we've printed for you. I think that's where I part company with those administrations and say, no, we should be welcoming the media. We should welcome any form of information that the media finds. We certainly at WADA were benefited by a number of media documentaries by very good journalists that help expose problems. That's their role. And on the other hand, they should also be critical of those of us who are in privileged positions running things like I was running. So I'm not afraid of criticism in the media. I'm not afraid of being criticised. I just hope it's from an emotional stance and not an emotional stance.
Bueno, agradecer a Howman su atención, su intervención y su disponibilidad para responder todas las preguntas, independientemente incluso sobre política actual, hasta el último momento. Con esto espero verles ahora a las 3 de la tarde. Thank you, Howman.